Rome in 55 BC belongs to three men, and Marcus Licinius Crassus is tired of being the boring one. Pompey has Spain and a reputation built on real wars against real enemies. Caesar is carving Gaul into provinces and mailing the Senate victory reports like postcards. Crassus has money, an almost unimaginable amount of it. He made his first fortune buying burning buildings in Rome cheap and putting out the fires with his own private brigade, then charging the owners for the rescue. He crushed Spartacus's slave army and crucified 6,000 of the survivors along the Appian Way, one corpse every few dozen meters for 100 miles, and even that victory got overshadowed. Pompey came home from a smaller campaign and claimed half the credit. Money built Rome's roads and bribed Rome's elections, but it never bought a triumph. Crassus wants one. Parthia is the target, a kingdom east of the Euphrates, rich, unconquered, and, this is the part that matters, not at war with Rome. No provocation, no border dispute, nothing. Crassus is 60 years old and picking a fight because the two men he shares power with have wars, and he doesn't. A tribune stands in front of him in the forum, in front of the crowd gathering to watch him leave for the east, and curses him by name. Calls the whole invasion illegal, unprovoked, an old man's vanity project paid for in other men's blood. Crassus walks past him, doesn't answer, boards the ship anyway. Rome and Parthia aren't strangers when Crassus picks this fight. They'd met once before, decades earlier, and it hadn't gone well. In 96 BC, a Roman general named Sulla, not yet the dictator he'd become, just a provincial governor doing border work in Cappadocia, meets the first Parthian ambassador Rome has ever dealt with, a man named Orobazes. It's meant to be a courtesy meeting on the banks of the Euphrates. Sulla turns it into a lesson. He orders 3 chairs set out, then seats himself in the middle, the seat of honor, with the Parthian envoy on one side and a minor client king on the other, as if Parthia, a kingdom that stretches from the Euphrates to the edge of India, is worth exactly as much as a small Roman-backed principality nobody outside the region has heard of. The insult isn't lost on anyone in the room, and Orobazes pays for it, not in Rome, but at home. When he returns to Parthia and reports what happened, his own king has him put to death for allowing a Parthian ambassador to be treated that way. That's the temperature of Parthian court honor decades before Crassus ever crosses the river. Rome disrespects you once, somebody dies for it, and it isn't always the Roman. Nobody in the Senate remembers that story 60 years later when Crassus asks for his army. If they had, they might have thought twice about picking a fight with a kingdom that kills its own diplomats over where they were told to sit. At Brundisium, waiting to cross to Syria, the fleet sails in winter weather most captains would refuse. Ships go down before the armies even left Italy. Nobody calls off the campaign. In Syria, Crassus spends a season doing what a man his age understands, counting money. He weighs the gold in the temple of Atargatis at Hierapolis, allegedly meaning to borrow against it, and the priests say the goddess herself tripped him on the way out. A bad sign that half the army hears about by nightfall. His own son, Publius, arrives with 1,000 hand-picked Gallic cavalry from Caesar's army in Gaul. Battle-tested, loyal, the best fighting men Crassus has anywhere near this campaign. It isn't enough to fix what's already wrong with the plan. Local allies warn him. Roman officers with real Eastern experience warn him. One in particular, Cassius Longinus, his own second in command, tells him plainly to stay near the river, keep supply lines close, don't let the army get pulled into open desert where infantry has no water and cavalry has all the room in the world. Crassus listens to a different man. Abgarus, a client king from the Arab borderlands, has fought alongside Rome before. He offers to guide the army by a shortcut. Cassius doesn't trust him. Crassus does. Nobody marching in this column has fought Parthians before. Most haven't fought anyone from this far east at all. Parthia isn't some border tribe. It's an empire in its own right, stretching from the Euphrates almost to India. sitting directly across the trade routes that move silk, spice, and silver between Rome and China. The wealth pouring through Parthian territory is part of why Crassus wants this war in the first place. What he doesn't understand, and what nobody in his command staff seems to have explained to him properly, is how that empire actually fights. Rome wins wars with infantry, disciplined men standing shoulder to shoulder, trained to advance, absorb a charge, and grind an enemy down at close range. It's worked against Gauls, against Greeks, against Carthage. Parthia doesn't field infantry worth mentioning at all. Its army is built entirely around the horse. Light cavalry archers who grow up riding before they can properly walk, capable of shooting backward at a full gallop with enough force to punch through mail. A trick Romans will come to call the Parthian shot for the rest of history. Behind them, heavy cataphracts, men and horses both armored head to hoof in overlapping scale, riding into a charge like a wall of metal built specifically to break a shield line. A Roman legion has never had to solve this problem before, because it has never had to fight an enemy who refuses to come within reach and never runs out of arrows. Crassus is about to find out what happens to disciplined infantry when discipline isn't the thing that decides the battle. The army crosses the Euphrates, 35,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, most of them legionaries who've never fought anything like what's coming. The river route would keep them fed, watered, and close to friendly towns the whole way. Abgarus leads them somewhere else entirely, straight out into open desert plain, sand and low scrub, no shade, no water source for a full day's march at a stretch. By the time anyone realizes the guide has walked them into the middle of nowhere, Abgarus is gone, riding off to gather intelligence, he says. He rides straight to the enemy instead. He was never working for Rome. Word arrives that Armenia's king, an ally who'd promised reinforcements and a safer northern route, has been invaded himself and can send no help at all. Crassus doesn't turn back, doesn't change the route, just keeps walking the army forward into ground he doesn't understand, toward an enemy he's never fought. Word reaches the column before the enemy does. Nomad scouts, most of them, don't come back. The ones who do talk about horsemen, a lot of them. What the Romans see first is nothing at all, a haze on the horizon, dull and empty, because the Parthian commander Surena has ordered every man in his army to cover his armor and his spear points with cloth and animal hide until the moment he wants to be seen. Then, all at once, the covers come off. 10,000 men in polished bronze and iron catch the desert sun in the same instant, and somewhere behind them war drums start. Deep ones, packed with metal discs, built specifically to rattle men who've never heard anything like it. It's a small army by Roman standards, 1,000 heavily armored cataphracts, men and horses both wrapped in scale from head to hoof, backed by 9,000 horse archers, no infantry at all. Against 35,000 Roman foot, it looks, for one long moment, like an insult. Crassus forms his men into a square, legions on every side, cavalry and light troops packed into the center, a formation built to survive being surrounded from any direction. It's the right instinct. It doesn't matter. The cataphracts charge first, a wall of iron aimed straight at the Roman line. Then, at the last possible moment, wheel away untouched, and the horse archers behind them start shooting instead. Not a volley, not a barrage that runs out. A storm that doesn't stop, because somewhere behind the Parthian line, a train of thousands of camels is standing by, loaded with nothing but replacement arrows. The Roman shield wall holds at first, men locking shields overhead and to the sides, the old formation built to survive exactly this. But a testudo that can't move is a testudo that just postpones the arrows instead of escaping them. Men in the packed center of the square have nowhere to retreat to and no clean shot to answer with. Shields split. Feet get pinned to the ground through boots that were never built to stop a heavy Parthian arrowhead. Nobody can get close enough to fight back. Every time the legions try to advance, the horse archers simply ride away, keep the range open, keep shooting. Crassus's answer is to send his son. Publius takes his 1,000 Gallic horsemen, a unit of light infantry and a handful of cohorts, and rides out to break the archers before they can keep grinding the main army down. It looks like it's working. The Parthians in front of him fall back, scatter, seem to run. Publius pushes the pursuit hard, chasing them further out onto open ground, further from the main army, further from any support. It's a trap, built for exactly this kind of confidence. The moment his men are strung out and isolated, the Cataphracts turn and come back. This time, not a feint, a real charge, straight into a formation that's lost its shape from the chase. The Gauls take the worst of it. Unused to the heat and the thirst of an open desert summer, their horses dying under them from spurring straight into Parthian lances, until there's nothing left to do but pull back on foot. Publius leads what's left to a low, sandy hillock, ties the surviving horses together in a ring for a makeshift wall, locks shields, and tries to hold. It doesn't buy them long. Publius is wounded, unable to hold a sword. He orders his own shield-bearer to finish it rather than be taken. Almost the entire detachment dies on that hill. The Parthians cut off Publius's head, fix it to the tip of a spear, and ride back toward the main Roman line to make sure Crassus sees it. Crassus is told his son is dead before he sees the proof of it riding toward him on a spear point. Plutarch says he tries to keep command of himself in front of the army, walks the ranks, tells his men that the grief is his and his alone to carry. The war is theirs, and it isn't finished. It doesn't hold the line together for long. The sight of the head breaks whatever nerve the legions had left more thoroughly than any tactic could. The arrow storm resumes, this time against soldiers who've just watched what happens to the ones who try to fight back directly. And the day ends with the Roman square battered, encircled, and no closer to breaking the Parthian line than it was at dawn. Dark falls, and Surena, for reasons nobody fully explains, pulls his army back rather than pressing the advantage through the night. Crassus is left with an army still standing, still armed, and completely without a plan. Roman officers make the decision Crassus can't. Under cover of dark, the army abandons its own wounded. 4,000 men left behind at the camp, too injured to march, calling out as the column pulls away, and starts moving toward the walled town of Carrhae, the nearest friendly ground. Cassius, the second in command who warned against all of this from the start, doesn't wait for Crassus's order. He takes 500 cavalry and strikes out on his own route, reaches Syria, and survives. It's the one command decision of the whole campaign that works exactly as intended, and it isn't Crassus who makes it. The main column, guided again by a local man named Andromachus, gets lost in marshland in the dark. The same pattern, a guide nobody should have trusted leading them somewhere a Roman army has no business being. By morning, the Parthians have found the abandoned wounded, killed every one of them, and caught up with 4 scattered cohorts that never reached the town at all. What's left of the army reaches Carrhae's walls in pieces, not as an army anymore. Surena surrounds Carrhae and sends word, surrender Crassus and Cassius in chains, and the rest can go free. The town has no food to hold a siege, and an army with no fight left in it. Crassus tries to slip out again by night, aiming for the hills and Armenia beyond, the same plan that failed once already. Surena, by his own account, doesn't want a siege that drags on and costs him men and time. He offers a different deal instead. A personal conference, a negotiated Roman withdrawal from Mesopotamia, terms Crassus can carry home as something other than total defeat. Crassus doesn't trust it. His own officers don't trust it. But the army, what's left of it, is done fighting and pushes him toward the table anyway. Soldiers surrounding their own general, shouting him down until he agrees to go. He walks out to the meeting on foot, which the Parthians treat as an insult before he's said a word. Their commander arrives on horseback and offers Crassus a horse of his own, a small detail that somehow tips into a shoving match between the two escorts. In the chaos, a Roman officer named Octavius draws his sword to defend Crassus and kills one of the Parthian grooms. He's cut down instantly. Crassus dies in the same scramble. Accounts differ on whether it was a deliberate killing or a soldier finishing what already looked inevitable. Either way, by the time the dust settles, he's dead, and there's no negotiation left to have. What happens to the body afterward depends on which Roman historian you trust least badly. Cassius Dio, writing more than 2 centuries later, claims the Parthians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat. A joke about a man who spent his whole life chasing money finally getting his fill of it. It's a story built for a moral, and it shows every sign of being exactly that, a story. What's better attested is stranger. Crassus's head is cut off and carried east to the Parthian king Orodes, who happens to be celebrating a royal wedding in Armenia at the very same palace. At the very same hour, a troupe of Greek actors is performing Euripides's Bacchae, a play that ends with a mother carrying her own son's severed head on stage as a trophy. When Crassus's real head arrives at the door, an actor named Jason of Tralles is standing mid-scene holding the prop. He hands off the fake head, picks up the real one, and finishes his lines with it instead. The court applauds. Plutarch, writing this down more than a century later, calls it the single strangest ending any Roman campaign has ever had, and doesn't seem to be exaggerating. Somewhere around 20,000 Roman dead by Plutarch's count, 10,000 more taken prisoner and marched east to guard a Parthian frontier they'll never leave. An entire field army wiped off the map against a Parthian force a fraction of its size, for a war nobody had declared, and nobody in Parthia had asked for. Surena rides back from Carrhae, the most celebrated man in Parthia. He didn't just win. He beat a Roman field army roughly 3 times his own numbers, killed 1 Triumvir and 1 Triumvir's son, and did it without losing more than a handful of men by most estimates. Soldiers sing about him. The king's court starts comparing him quietly to King Orodes himself. That comparison is the mistake. Orodes doesn't see a loyal general. He sees a subject more popular than his own king, commanding troops that clearly trust him more than they trust the throne. Surena has already done one thing that should have been a warning to him. A few years earlier, it was Surena's cavalry that had put Orodes on the throne in the first place, unseating a rival claimant. A man who can make a king can unmake one too. And Orodes isn't willing to find out which way that goes a second time. Within the same year as Carrhae, Orodes has the man who just delivered him the greatest Parthian victory in a generation, quietly put to death. No trial that history records, no public reason given. The same jealousy that started this whole war on the Roman side. An old man who couldn't stand watching Caesar and Pompey outshine him, ends it on the Parthian side too. 2 empires, 2 proud men, and in both cases, envy costs a life the war itself didn't take. Carrhae doesn't just end a campaign, it ends a triumvirate. With Crassus gone, there's no third man left to balance the other 2. Nothing standing between Caesar and Pompey except each other. And inside 5 years, that balance collapses into a civil war that ends the Republic itself. The eagle standards lost at Carrhae, the sacred symbols of the legions that died there, stay in Parthian hands for over 30 years, a permanent public reminder that Rome lost, out east, to an enemy most Romans back home had never even heard of before Crassus decided to make himself their conqueror.